Welcome back. We're in Old Western Culture, Year 2, Quarter 4. Here we're at the end of our year on the Romans because Christianity grows up in the Roman Empire, and so in this fourth quarter we've been talking about the Nicene age of Christianity, the 4th century, the great age of some of the greatest theologians and some of the great church councils, and now one of the greatest men from the perspective of Western Christianity in particular, Augustine, who wrote a tremendous amount. This man, and I'll tell you the story of his life here in just a moment, but we have over 100 of his books, over 500 of his sermons and letters, a tremendous amount, and he surely wrote more that we don't have. So we know a great deal about him. He's had a huge influence on Christianity in Old Western culture, and Augustine's influence extends beyond theology and doctrine and church matters to other things as well, to Western conceptions of politics, of economics, of church-state relations, of what nations are like, and what war is like. In fact, there's a centuries-running discussion of whether wars can be just, and if they are, on what score. And Augustine is kind of the father of just war theory. He talks about aesthetics, he talks about economics, he talks about philosophy. He has a profound influence. In fact, if you had to pick one author ever since the close of the biblical canon in the last 2,000 years in Old Western culture who's had the most influence, Augustine would definitely be in the running. He'd be on the short list and probably at the top of it. Other figures that we think of as really great influential figures like Thomas Aquinas, he was an Augustinian. He quotes Augustine all the time to bolster his arguments. Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk. John Calvin quotes Augustine more than anybody outside the Bible. So even other figures later on that we look to and say, well, these are definitely influential figures in Western culture, even they are influenced by Augustine. So he would certainly be on the very, very short list of the most influential figures in the last 2,000 years in Western culture. And I hope you'll see that as we talk about the Confessions here and in future lectures on the City of God. So Augustine is born in North Africa. He was born in North Africa in the year 354 in a little town called Tagaste, which is in modern-day Algeria. And by the way, modern North Africa is entirely under the dominion of Islam. But to this day, that little remote village, which goes by another name, an Arabic name now, that little remote village still remembers that Augustine was born there. They probably know next to nothing about Augustine. They know next to nothing about Christianity, but they still remember that their village is where the great Christian lived. And they remember that with pride. And so when the rare visitor can go there, it's difficult to travel in that country because of modern conditions, but when the rare visitor goes there, they will tell you that this is where the great Christian lived. So he's born in Tagaste, in inland North Africa. North Africa was a beautiful, fertile, well-watered country. We always think of North Africa as Sahara, but the belt along the Mediterranean coast, something like 50 to 100 miles inland, is actually very fertile and green. In fact, Augustine's region of North Africa, the Roman province of Africa, was one of the breadbaskets of the empire. It provided a tremendous amount of grain, olives, grapes, and so on. Up there with Gaul and the Nile Valley, it was probably one of the three major agricultural producing countries in the Roman Empire. He comes from a pagan father named Patricius and a Christian mother named Monica. Monica will turn out to be perhaps the human hero of the entire story. She's a faithful Christian woman, doesn't really have all her theological ducks in a row, but she is very faithful, very godly, prays for her son always. You'll see what a profound influence she is on Augustine's life in this book. Patricius and Monica both want their son Augustine, who has some siblings, by the way. We know at least that he had some brothers and a sister. We hear almost nothing about them in his works, but just enough to know that they're there. They were probably Christians. Patricius and Monica want Augustine, who shows real talent at a young age, to become well-educated. Augustine says in this book, The Confessions, that his father Patricius wanted young Augustine to be well-educated so that he would have great glory in the world, a good reputation. In other words, worldly reasons. Monica, a Christian, wanted Augustine to be well educated because she was pretty sure that that education would lead him back to Christ, would show him the truth of God. And in fact, that's what happened. By the time he's 16, he's already deeply involved in worldly matters. And by the time he's 16 or 17, young Augustine moves to the city of Carthage, which is on the north coast of Africa, not inland. So he moves to the coast of Africa. Carthage is the great city. You'll recall that centuries earlier, Rome had destroyed the Carthaginians in the Punic War and leveled the city. But the Romans rebuilt the city as a great port city, and now that's what it is. Carthage is again a great Roman city with a great harbor, a great university culture, and so on, and Augustine goes there in his late teens to teach. But by the time he's 16 or 17 years old, he also already has a mistress, and by her, a young son named Deodatus, which significantly means, as you Latin scholars will guess, gift of God, a Deo datus, by God given. And so now in his late teens, he's brilliantly educated, and by the time he's 18 or 19, he's already teaching. He's teaching literature and rhetoric at Carthage. Later on, then he will move, taking his mistress and his son and his mother, Monica, with him to Rome, because in his late teens, by the time he's 18 or 19, his father Patricius has died, but wonderfully become a Christian on his deathbed. So Patricius the pagan does come to faith in Christ before he dies. And so Augustine's mother Monica, having no husband, now follows her son. Augustine moves to Rome. He teaches in Rome, Italy, for a number of years until his mid to late 20s. And then he moves up to northern Italy, Milan, where Ambrose, the great bishop of Milan, resides, and which also is one of the summer residences of the Emperor Theodosius. Augustine teaches there in Milan for a while. There he's converted to Christ under the influence of Ambrose, gives up his teaching career, moves back to Africa, to his hometown of Tagaste. There founds a sort of informal, semi-monastic community of a bunch of young men who are recent converts to Christ, devoted to studying the scriptures and theology. And for a few years they share a house and live there in Tagaste. And then Augustine is made bishop of Hippo Regius, a city on the north coast of Africa, about 100 miles or so west of Carthage. And so if you look at a map, you'll see that there's 5 places geographically associated with the entirety of Augustine's life. Tagaste, where he's born and raised; Carthage, where he lives and begins teaching; Rome, where he continues his teaching career; Milan, where he further teaches and is converted under the influence of Ambrose; and then Hippo, where he's a bishop for the remaining 45 years of his life. So far as I know, he didn't travel much outside these regions, even as a great bishop. He probably traveled to other regions of North Africa. But we have no evidence, for example, that he went east to Egypt, where the Alexandrian Christians were doing great work in doctrine and so on. But he lives in those 5 regions, spending the bulk of his Christian career in Hippo, where most of his stuff is written. Now, he did write a book in his pagan days before his conversion on beauty and aesthetics, and he talks about that in the Confessions. And shortly after his conversion, he writes a book of soliloquies, sort of patterned after Plato's dialogues involving Socrates. And then he writes a tremendous amount of stuff in his career as a Christian. This book, The Confessions, a powerful book on the Trinity, his great book, The City of God, many sermons on the Psalms, which are well worth reading because he talks about how Christ can be seen in all of the Psalms. He writes a book called On Christian Doctrine, where he talks about Christian homiletics and exegesis and Christian rhetoric. He has books on baptismal lectures and exposition of the Lord's Prayer and so on. A great many writings. But the vast majority of those, in fact almost all of those with the exception of one book that we know of, were written when he was a Christian. So the Confessions here is written 10 or 15 years after he becomes a Christian, and he's looking back at his early life and talking about what brought him to faith in Christ. Now, if you know your C.S. Lewis, and you should, you know that C.S. Lewis's spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, is the story of C.S. Lewis's struggles and wanderings and rebellion and looking for truth and for intellectual satisfaction in many philosophies, all through his teens and his 20s, and finally Lewis comes to faith in Christ shortly after he's 30. The same for Augustine. He's 32 or 33 when he becomes a Christian. If you've read Lewis's Surprised by Joy, then after you read the Confessions, you will agree, I think, that there's a good chance Lewis had this book in mind because the parallels are so striking. Both men are looking for truth, wandering here, finding no truth there, going here, finding no satisfaction there, kind of bouncing back and forth, looking for, going up blind alleys, going up box canyons, and when they don't find satisfaction there, being unwilling to settle for second best and continuing to search for truth wherever it might be found. So Augustine and Lewis are very similar in their in the story of their trajectory leading to Christ, both coming to faith in Christ by the age of 30, 32, 33. So Augustine writes this book, The Confessions, and in the first 9 books out of the 13 that comprise it, the first 9 books are the story of his spiritual journey. The last 4 books after he's converted are philosophical. They're expositions of Genesis 1 and creation, and then rabbit trails going off from there, talking about how the creation by God of the entire world has significance for everything we think about. So the last 4 books are wonderful, but I'm going to focus just on the first 9 books, and just have you read those first 9. You of course are welcome and encouraged to read the last 4, but I'm going to talk about the first 9 because they're the story of his life. He doesn't tell us anything really autobiographical after his conversion is over. So here in the Confessions, he opens with what appears to be, and obviously is, and I asked you to look for this, a prayer to God. He says, "Can any praise be worthy of the Lord's majesty? How magnificent his strength, how inscrutable his wisdom. Man is one of your creatures, Lord, and his instinct is to praise you. He bears about him the mark of death, the sign of his own sin, to remind him that you thwart the proud. But still, since he is part of your creation, he wishes to praise you. The thought of you stirs him so deeply that he cannot be content unless he praises you, because you made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until they rest in you." Or a more literal translation of the Latin might be, our hearts are unquiet, restless, until they find peace, find rest in you. And if you are a student of Latin at all, it's easy to find the Confessions in Latin on the internet. And look at these opening passages and try to translate it. It's not difficult Latin, and it's very interesting to see how he expressed himself originally in the Latin language, because that's the language he wrote this in. Augustine knew Greek, but he tells us himself in the Confessions he was never really comfortable with Greek, and so he uses the Latin language. And also, by the way, I might add that connected with this is the fact that when Augustine reads and quotes the Bible, he's reading and quoting from a Latin translation of the Bible, but it's not the one we think of as the Vulgate. The Vulgate hasn't actually become popular yet. Jerome has probably translated it by the time this book is written, or at least still working on it, but it hasn't become widely disseminated. No, what Augustine is reading is what's called the Old Latin Bible. It's a Latin translation made of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done by Jews long before the time of Christ, and then the New Testament as well, which was done in Greek. So Augustine is reading a Latin translation of the Greek Old and New Testaments. He will have something to say about that in The City of God, which we'll talk about in future lectures, about the meaning of translations and so on. But it is interesting that he's using an Old Latin translation. Now he goes on and he talks here in this first chapter about how God has been with him in the form of questions. God, how can we properly praise you? Those who look for you will cry out in praise of you. But where are you when we don't think of you? How can it be that we who have our origin and our existence in you, we who depend on you for our life, how can it be that we don't think of you, that we even rebel against you? He asks in chapter 3, how can earth and heaven contain the whole of you since you fill them? He's thinking about who is this God who is our life, who's made everything. In chapter 4, who is this God that I worship? And in the middle of chapter 4, he says, you gather all things to yourself, though you suffer no need. You support, you fill, and you protect all things. You create them, nourish them, and bring them to perfection. You seek to make them your own, though you lack for nothing. You love your creatures, but with a gentle love. You treasure them, but without apprehension. You grieve for wrong, but suffer no pain. You can be angry and yet serene. Your works are varied, but your purpose is one and the same. You welcome all who come to you, though you never lost them. So along with the opening paragraph where he says our hearts are restless till they find rest in you, this passage, you welcome all who come to you, though you never lost them, is part of the, you might say, theme of this book. All through this story, Augustine talks about how he's running from God, he's rejecting the Christian teachings about who God is, and looking for truth in this philosophy and that heresy and this circumstance and so on. And rebels in that position often think that they're far from God. But here Augustine says, you welcome all who come to you, though you never lost them. God was never absent. God was always there, even when Augustine didn't believe it and didn't know it. God was always there, working out circumstances, drawing Augustine with cords of love, drawing him with the movements of the prayers of his mother and the teaching of local bishops and so on. God was always there working to bring Augustine back, and that's what he's confessing in this book. So I asked you when I gave the assignment to think about what is he confessing. Well, people often think that it's called the confession, so he must be confessing his sin, his wickedness, as though Augustine wants to wallow morbidly in his evil. There have been people in later history who have written books called the Confessions that do precisely that. The famous Frenchman Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century writes a book called The Confessions, in which he does just that. The man is a moral wretch and degenerate, and he spends the book confessing what a moral jerk he is and practically delighting in it. But Augustine's not doing this. He's confessing his sin, yes, but only to show what God has brought him out of, and to show that he has struggles like other people do, so that people will perhaps be encouraged to come to Augustine, their Christian pastor, having read this book, and say, Augustine, I now see that you've struggled with the same thing, so I need help. Can you help me? You can relate to me. But he's also confessing, and he's primarily confessing God. This is a book that confesses the Lord and the Lord's power in bringing Augustine back to him. So this is not a book devoted to wallowing morbidly in his sin and wickedness so that people can take great delight in all the evils he did, but so that we can take delight in God's rescue of him from the chains of sin. That's his purpose in writing this book. So you welcome all who come to you, though you never lost them. Then he goes on and he discusses in Book 1 the fact that he's sent to school by his parents, and in his school, his teachers beat him when he makes mistakes, and Augustine objects to that. He says, beating a child is a really dumb thing to do. It's a really bad thing to do. It's wrong. Augustine is one of those rare voices in the ancient world, along with the rhetorician Quintilian and some others that we know, who objected to the floggings that apparently were so common in Roman schools for boys. But he objects to something else too, and this is where a lot of people make a mistake when they read this book. They say Augustine was given a classical education and now he's rejecting it and saying that's a bad thing. And he's not. What he says is bad is that his teachers, when he's at school, who teach him grammar, logic, rhetoric, drama, literature, poetry, history, and so on, they teach him all these stories. They teach him to get his math sums right. They teach him to get his grammar right. And when he makes a mistake in math or in pronunciation or in grammar, he gets beaten for the mistakes. But when he lies, or when he's angry and strikes a schoolmate, the teachers just chuckle. And Augustine says, this is the real sin, that they paid more attention and cared more about me pronouncing my H's right and getting 4 when I add 2 plus 2 than they did about whether my soul is right, whether my soul is healed and sound. They cared less about my moral condition than my intellectual condition, and that's an inverted priority. So that's what he's blasting. He's blasting their concern with things that are of less importance in God's eyes and have no concern for his moral character. In Book 2, then before he goes off to Carthage to continue his studies, he talks about how as a young teenager he's already in the grip of lust. His mother had refused to have him baptized when he was a boy because she said once he has the seal of baptism on him, the stamp of Christ on his soul, then if he sins, as he surely will do as an adolescent, it will break that seal, it will break that mold, and then what? Baptism pays for the previous sins, but what will cover the sins after his baptism? Which shows us that, as I said earlier, she doesn't really have an astute theology, but she does love Jesus Christ. She is a godly woman, in spite of the fact that she's got some problems in her theology. So he's not baptized yet, and he won't be baptized until the end of the story. But because as he becomes a teenager, he's caught in the grip of lust, and he's very much a sensualist and very much in the grip of his passions and his love of passion. By the time he's 16, he takes a mistress, and as I said before, she gives him a son. So by the time he's 17, he's got a mistress and a little baby son. But he's also, in worldly terms, doing very well. He's very well educated. But at the end of Book 2, he tells us another episode. Just before going off to Carthage, he's living at Tagaste, he's about 16, he's hanging out with his buddies, and one day they steal some pears off a pear tree. And he makes a big deal about this at the end of Book 2, robbing the pear tree. They find a tree full of ripe pears, they pull all the pears off the tree, and they throw them to some nearby pigs. And Augustine spends a lot of time on this, and this is another episode that is commonly misunderstood in modern readers, among modern readers of the Confessions, especially non-Christians, who laugh and say, "Isn't that just like you stupid Christians? You're always concerned about little things. Oh, he stole some pears. Oh, what a wicked man." But Augustine makes it really clear what the sin was here. He says, if I had stolen the pears because I was hungry, thus testifying to the goodness of the food that pears are. Or if I had stolen the pears because they were beautiful and I wanted to give them to my mother, put them in a bowl at home, testifying to their goodness as beautiful objects. That would have been still would have been theft, but there would have been something admirable, or at least something laudable, in that I recognized a good. But he says that's not why I stole them. He says, number one, I stole the pears precisely because it was stealing and I wanted to do something wrong. So it's not about the pears, it's about his perverse desire to do wickedness. So in this sense, is stealing pears like committing murder? No, of course not. But in the impulse of his heart, it's the same thing. He has the impulse to do something wrong and perverse precisely because it was wrong and perverse. He didn't care about the pears as a good object. He threw them away to the pigs. Secondly, he says, I did it because I was with my buddies and I wanted to show off with them and show I was quite the fellow and so on. And so he says, I submitted to peer pressure, or pear pressure. Now, we might think he's excusing himself, but no, he's not. In fact, he blames himself even further. He says, this doesn't make me better, this makes me worse. I wanted to show myself as a fine fellow in their eyes. I wanted to make myself out as I'm one of the guys. I wanted to show off in front of them. Submitting to this peer pressure, he says, is not an excuse. It's a further evidence of my sin. So it doesn't matter that it was stealing pears. They might as well have been stabbing some innocent beggar lying by the roadside. The point was not what the external action. The point was the impulse of his heart. Now, stabbing the poor beggar by the roadside would have been much worse, of course, for the poor beggar. That would have been a worse sin. But the impulse of his heart is what he's talking about. He has a heart that is taking pleasure in wickedness for wickedness' own sake. Well, then he goes to Carthage in Book 3. Now, he's about 16 years old. This is about the year 370. So to compare this to earlier discussions we've had in previous lectures, at this point, Basil the Great is one of the great bishops. He's late in his life already. Gregory Nazianzus also is a great bishop. John Chrysostom is in his 20s, living his life as a monk and so on. Athanasius is an old man. But all these other church fathers are off in the east. Augustine, this young pagan, is in the Western Mediterranean, in Western North Africa, and he knows nothing, or probably knows nothing, about these great men in the east. If he's heard of them, as he might have, it's not very meaningful to him. So now he goes to Carthage, and here he simply gives himself up to sensuality, the life of pleasure. Now, one of his pleasures is going to the theater. And here again, moderns misunderstand this, and they roll their eyes and laugh and say, "Oh, what a wicked man, going to plays." You know, how silly is that? Well, Augustine again makes it clear what the real problem is here. He's going to the theater, and we might add parenthetically that most people don't really know what the ancient Roman theater was like. It was pretty gross very often. I mean, the obscenity on a scale that we don't, well, up until recent times, don't see in the theater or in movies. But secondly, Augustine says that he goes to the theater because he wants his emotions stirred. He wants to feel the passion. He loves tearjerkers. He loves tragedies. He loves what we might call, chick flicks. He would probably like those. He particularly loved, for example, the story of Aeneas and Dido, and that was a very popular topic to be presented dramatically on the stage. And so he loved to go to the theater, have his emotions stirred up, have a really good cry, go away weeping and sobbing and saying, "Wasn't that great?" He loved to feel his heart being broken. He loved to feel that he was alive by feeling his emotions and his passions. But the problem was, Augustine says, he was making himself a slave of his passions. He was not a master of himself. He's enslaving himself to passion. Now, passions and desires and so on and emotions are not bad in themselves, and Augustine makes that clear. The problem is when I allow them to be the master over me, when I'm governed by my passions and not the governor of my passions. And he's making himself a slave. He's building chains around him, he says, enslaved by his own passions. Outwardly, though, he's still doing pretty well. He's teaching at Carthage. He's a teacher of rhetoric and of grammar and of literature. He reads a book that really is the beginning of the long search for Christ that he's about to embark on. He's been studying philosophy. He's dissatisfied with the claims of truth in all the philosophers of his day. This philosopher says, I have the truth. This philosopher says, I have the truth. Augustine is not satisfied by any of what he's read, and he's read a lot, and he's a brilliant young man, understands what he reads and sees the flaws. So now he picks up a book by Cicero, the old Roman orator from the Augustan age, from the 1st century BC, whom we've talked about back in Quarter 2. Picks up a book by Cicero called the Hortensius. Hortensius was a rhetorician in the 1st century, a friend of Cicero's, and Cicero wrote a book named after his friend, writing about his life and so on. We do know that Hortensius was a real guy. He was a real rhetorician, a very interesting fellow. He had a daughter named Hortensia, and he homeschooled his daughter. He taught her rhetoric, and she became one of the few women in Roman history that we know of who actually spoke publicly in the Roman Senate. And wowed the senators. She was a good rhetorician, well trained by her father in her homeschool. So Hortensius was quite an interesting guy. And Cicero writes this book about Hortensius, and in it he talks about rhetoric, he talks about the pursuit of truth, he talks about philosophy, and he says this. He says that we must seek truth or seek wisdom wherever it may be found. And Augustine reads that, and he goes, yes, that's my goal from now on in my life. Seek truth wherever it may be found. And from this time on, what we see in Augustine, what we see the pattern of his life becoming, is one of refusing to settle for second best, as I said earlier. He's going to try this philosophy, but if it doesn't answer his questions, he won't just say, oh, well, it's good enough, I guess I can live with this. He's going to reject it and look somewhere else. If that doesn't satisfy him, he'll reject that and look over in this heresy, in this philosophy, in this cult, in this teaching. And if they don't satisfy him completely, he'll abandon it and say, I will keep looking until I find the satisfaction of my soul. Believing, apparently, although he doesn't say this explicitly, I think it's obvious, he believes what C.S. Lewis said, that the very existence of hunger proves the existence of food. The fact that he's hungry philosophically means there must be satisfaction. And to settle for second best, to settle for a philosophy or a teaching or a worldview that doesn't answer all his questions, is to deny that there are answers. But he believes there are answers, and so he keeps looking. So he listens to Cicero, seek truth wherever it may be found. Now that means that this book, The Hortensius by Cicero, is a major figure in moving Augustine to become a Christian. And so, because Augustine's such a huge influence on Western culture, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Cicero's book of the Hortensius. Guess what? It doesn't exist. We don't have it. It's lost. At least no one's found it. It may be hidden away in some dusty scroll in some monastery on Mount Athos, Greece, or deep in the archives of the Vatican Library, but nobody has ever found it. The last we hear about the Hortensius is Augustine's own mention of it in this book and in the City of God. But in the Middle Ages, nobody had it. In the Renaissance, nobody had it. In the modern world, nobody. We've lost it. It's like Aristotle's lost work on comedy. What wouldn't we give to find that? And the man who finds the manuscript of Aristotle's lost work on comedy or Cicero's Hortensius is going to be a wealthy and famous man. So go looking. So the Hortensius is lost, but we know it existed, and it had a signal role in moving Augustine towards searching for truth. In this search for truth, he hears about a new sect of Christians called the Manichees. And he joins the Manichees because they claim to have a rational, scientific explanation for the universe, for the world as it is. And so Augustine joins them. He becomes a Manichee. Now, it's not going to last for long. He's going to start asking questions of it, as he has of all of his philosophical attempts. And before long, he'll realize that the Manichees really don't have anything substantive to offer. But at the moment, he falls for them. He tells us later, and in the Confessions, he says, really, talk about a stupid philosophy. When it comes down to, he says, now they wouldn't put it this way. They put it much more subtly and cleverly, and they seduce and deceive people. But basically, it's a dualistic philosophy. The Manichees taught that good and evil are two ultimately powerful principles in the cosmos, and everything is matter. Everything in the universe is made up of particles of good and particles of evil, and they're in constant warfare with each other. And in that warfare, they mix and intermingle and get confused and blended together. And so the job of the adepts, the elites in the Manichee religion, in the Manichee faith, is to help to be on the forefront of separating good from evil and helping evil to fail and good to win. And Augustine says one way that they do that is through eating. Now, a Manichee adept certainly can't kill and eat an animal because an animal is a living being. They're strict vegetarians. But an adept can't even pick a vegetable because that would be killing the vegetable. So you have your apprentices pick the vegetable for you, and then you eat the vegetable. And as you eat your food, it goes into your digestive system. The digestive system, in the process of breaking down the food particles, separates the good ones from the evil ones. And the evil particles you excrete as waste, and the good particles you breathe out when you exhale. And this is how we help good to win, by eating and digesting. And when you put it that way, it sounds pretty stupid, and it is. They, of course, would never put it that way. The way that they explained it, it sounds very rational and very scientific, and Augustine, being a brilliant young man, falls for it for a short time. They have a worldview. It's much broader than the things I've just talked about. They have a Gnostic worldview that teaches a great many things, but Augustine realizes they don't ultimately have an answer. So he joins the Manichees, and he wants his mother, Monica, to become a Manichee too. She, meanwhile, being a faithful Christian woman, is praying for his soul, praying for her fat-headed young son every day and every night. But he hopes that she'll become a Manichee. One night she has a dream, and in this dream she sees a man, like an angel, telling her something. She sees a yardstick, and on one end of the yardstick she's standing, on the other end of the yardstick Augustine's standing. The angel says, "Where you are, he will be someday." And she rejoices, takes this as a message from God that she should have hope. Augustine will become a Christian. Where you are, he will be. She tells young Augustine this, and he says, "Oh, mother, don't you realize that means you'll become a Manichee?" And she says, "No." She sticks to her vision. He said, "Where I am, you will be," not the other way around. So a little point of grammar, she shows herself faithful. She also, by the way, in the same in these early books, says that she was in the habit of visiting her local priest, her local pastor, and asking him to talk to Augustine. "Would you please talk to my son? He's smart, but he's a fathead. Would you please talk to him about Christ and explain to him, and to take him some Ravi Zacharias and some Josh McDowell and some Cornelius Van Til. Would you please explain to him why Christianity is right?" And the priest would go, "Oh, I don't have time for this. Woman, go away." And she kept knocking on her pastor's study door saying, "Would you talk to my son?" And finally, one day, the priest, in exasperation, throws up his hands and shouts, "I can't believe that the son of these tears will ever be lost." And she goes, woohoo, takes this as another sign from God that in this priest's exasperated exclamation is a promise that her son will be saved. So Monica has real hope and real confidence that her son, who's the dumbest smart person she ever knew, is going to become a Christian someday. He'll get out of his Manichaeism, he'll give up his pursuit of philosophy, and become a Christian. Well, he becomes a teacher. He teaches rhetoric at Carthage. He takes up astrology. He has a number of friends that he spends a lot of time with. And his friendship means a lot. The friendship of this group of men he hangs out with is very important to him. So important that when one of his friends dies, which is going to happen shortly, he's devastated. He's crushed by the death of this friend. And he has a lengthy and a beautiful passage on the value of friendship, which is really good, talking about how friends console each other, provide comfort, stimulate each other to pursuit of virtue and good works, how friends complement each other's souls, and so on. It's a really great passage. But his love of his friends is another idolatry, along with his love of passion and sensuality, along with his love of philosophy and pride in his own intellect. His love of his friends, though friendship is a good thing, his love of his friends is simply another idolatry, trying to find satisfaction there. And when one of his friends dies, that shows he's shaken, because this shows that even these friends in whom he put so much faith and confidence and love are only temporary and are mutable, can be taken away. Well, one of the famous Manichean leaders, a guy named Faustus, comes to town. Augustine pumps him with questions. Faustus cannot answer his questions. He's honest enough to say, I don't know. And Augustine gives up Manichaeism. He doesn't actually leave it right away because he doesn't know where else to go, but he's disillusioned thoroughly with the Manichees. He now decides to go to Rome, where he can get better pay than he gets at Carthage. His mother wants to come with him. He doesn't want her to go. So he says, we're going to sail in the morning, Mom. And so she takes a room for the night, and in the middle of the night, without her knowing, he secretly gets on a ship and sails away, leaving her behind. She grieves, of course, at the deception of her stupid young son, but she gets the next ship and sails to Rome and continues to live with Augustine and his mistress and their son, Monica's grandson. He takes up teaching there in Rome, and he begins studying the Platonists and the Neoplatonists, the revival of the teachings of Plato that's going on here in the 300s. The Neoplatonists were a powerful new philosophy. They're like the Gnostics in Christianity, which I've talked about in previous lectures. The Neoplatonists were were not Christian. They were a philosophy that was religious, a philosophy that gave a religious outlook on life. And the Gnostics that claimed to be Christians, that were Christian heretics like the Arians and so on, that the Christians had to struggle so hard against, were simply, in one sense, simply Neoplatonists who tried to be Christians. So a heretic is someone who claims to be a Christian but denies some fundamental Christian teaching. The Neoplatonists weren't heretics. They were simply a totally different religion altogether. They were false, but the label heretic wouldn't apply to them. And then from Rome, Augustine moves, in Book 5, we're told he moves to Milan. He says the teaching conditions in Rome weren't all that great. The students were wild and noisy and obstreperous and ill-behaved. And Augustine had a hard time collecting fees from the students' parents anyway. The students are running around, bursting into classrooms, jumping up and down and shouting. And so Augustine hears that there's a position in Milan, in northern Italy, at the foot of the Italian Alps, up in a beautiful valley where Italy becomes part of the continent. He moves up there and begins teaching there. And there he encounters Ambrose, the great bishop of the church in Milan. He goes to listen to Ambrose teaching in the church there, in the great cathedral at Milan, simply because Ambrose has a reputation as a brilliant orator, as being very eloquent. And Augustine loves eloquence. Remember, he's a teacher of rhetoric, and so he admires eloquence, and he goes to listen to Ambrose to hear what all the fuss is about. People say he's such a great speaker. And he enjoys listening to Ambrose, and he's listening to him for the way he speaks, but it's not long before he begins listening to the content of what he's speaking about. And he realizes that Ambrose is beginning to answer some of the difficulties that the Manichees had raised for Augustine. He's still far from Christ, but he's beginning to take seriously some of the things that this great Christian Ambrose are saying. So he's abandoned the Manichees. He's listening to Ambrose, and it won't be long before his mother will move from Rome to Milan as well, and also be very impressed with Ambrose. But that'll be in the reading for next time. So at this point in the book, we've got Augustine in his mid to late 20s. He's grown up a brilliant young man. He's a teacher. He's a profound thinker. He's read more than anybody else. He understands widely, but what he understands primarily is that there are no real answers for the longings of his soul for truth in any of the philosophies that he reads, or the religions that he's fallen for, or the passions that he gives himself over to in theaters and entertainment, or with his mistress and so on. So he's looking for truth and wisdom and not finding it, but it's starting to dawn on him that there's something in Christianity, and it's Ambrose of Milan who's revealing that to him. So in the next lecture then, we're going to talk about the rest of the story and what comes of this encounter with Ambrose. To prepare for the next lecture, read Augustine's Confessions, books 6 through 9. Remember that Augustine has moved as a young teacher from Rome to Milan, hoping conditions will be better, and there he comes under the influence of the great Christian bishop Ambrose. As you read, watch for Ambrose's influence on Augustine, answering many questions that the intelligent young man has. Watch for his mother Monica's influence on him, and watch especially for the influence on him of the Christian biographies that he reads, and finally for the great story of his conversion in Book 8.